Oh. We are studying Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga and the chapter titled The Object of Knowledge. And I propose to present in summary some key ideas which we have covered and where Sri Aurobindo points to from there. We've seen that when the human consciousness turns to know truly, to know reality, to know the deepest knowledge, the deepest truth, the object of this spiritual knowing is the divine, the supreme, the infinite, the absolute. But neither the universe nor we as individuals are able to know that directly, although there is a relationship from that aim of our knowledge to what we are and to what the universe is. When we try to know the universe, when we try to know ourselves, we find that the knowledge which we gain through our senses is not correct. And there is a process gradually of removing the errors by which we begin to approach a deeper knowledge both of ourselves and of the universe. How far can we go? And he points out that that which we are seeking to know is outside the domain of our senses and it's outside the domain of our intellect. So although we begin our journey through the senses and we begin to understand through the intellect, there comes a point beyond which the senses cannot go and the intellect cannot go. We can stop at that borderline, but then we do not know the real thing. And then we reduce all that appears in the universe, remove the veils of appearance and try to go to some essentiality. And the other way is by a subjective approach where we try to find our own deepest origin. And there, obviously, we have to turn to an inner sense, and even the mind, the rationality has not too much role to play. Either way, we can only approach so far. And there comes a point beyond which we have to say, not this, not this, not this, in order to get to that absolute. But the portion in the paragraph which we are about to read, there Sri Aurobindo says that this necessity of approaching through such methods, these are devices the human mind is compelled to use if it is to form to itself any conception at all of a transcendent and unconditioned absolute. The system of negation is indispensable to it in order to get rid of its own definitions and limited experience. It is obliged to escape through a vague, indefinite into the infinite, for it lives in a closed prison of constructions and representations that are necessary for its action but are not the self-existent truth, either of matter or life or mind or spirit. And so we find justification for the need to break away by a negation, not this, not this, not this. But the problem is because the mind is bound to a prison of constructions and representations without which it cannot function. And this is where the genius of Sri Aurobindo comes in. He says, mind is not our only device for knowing. We have other means of knowledge. And for that, he says, but if we can once cross beyond the mind's frontier twilight into the vast plane of supramental knowledge, these devices cease to be indispensable. Supermind has quite another, a positive and direct and living experience of the Supreme Infinite. And then he describes how Supermind sees that infinite and all its multiple facets. And he has a long list of experiences. He says the absolute is beyond personality and beyond impersonality. And yet it is both the impersonal and the supreme person and all persons. The absolute is beyond distinction of unity and multiplicity, yet it is the one and the innumerable many in all the universes. It is beyond all limitation by quality, yet it is not limited by quality less void, but is to all infinite quality. And then he goes on a list. The individual soul, it is the cosmic and supracosmic spirit, the supreme Lord, the supreme self, the supreme Purusha, the supreme Shakti, the ever unborn who is endlessly born, the infinite who is innumerably finite, the multitudinous one, the complex simple, the many-sided single, the word of the silence ineffable, the impersonal omnipresent person, the mystery, and so on. And what is interesting in this text, which we will take up in detail next week, he is listing one by one all of the highest spiritual experiences that have been the basis for so many religions, so many spiritual traditions and lineages, and so many of these are still held in these traditions as the highest possible experience. The problem, though, is one of these experiences is seen to be contradicted by the other. If you say the divine is one, and another says the divine is all, how can he be one and all? So someone says the divine is impersonality, another says but the divine is the divine person, and he is all persons. How can this be possible at the same time? So in the series that he describes, these opposites, as if contradictions of the experiences, are all put in a single sequence. And he says, these things are to the dimensional mind irreconcilable opposites. But to the constant vision and experience of the supramental truth consciousness, they are so simply and inevitably the intrinsic nature of each other that even to think of them as contraries is an unimaginable violence. For the mind, these are contradictions, but when we see the same thing from the supramental consciousness, they are simply facets of each other. And we see how, if one is true, the others also follow, obviously, as simply facets of one continuity, one completeness of the divine experience. And to put them in opposition is a violence. And it is he uses such a beautiful phrase, unimaginable violence for the supramental consciousness. And this, therefore, is the focus of Sri Aurobindo's approach in realizing the divine. He says, the walls constructed by the measuring and separating intellect have disappeared, and the truth in its simplicity and beauty appears and reduces all to terms of its harmony and unity and light. Dimensions and distinctions remain, but as figures for use, not as a separative prison for the self-forgetting spirit. It is from such a consciousness of the supramental vision and experience that Sri Aurobindo articulated all that he had to write in all these volumes of the Life Divine, the Synthesis of Yoga, and the numerous other books that he was writing in the period of the Arya. Incidentally, yesterday, the 14th of August, was the 100th anniversary of the first issue of the Arya that Sri Aurobindo wrote, and it is there that this whole downpour of spiritual knowledge experience began in written form. He continued, as you know, for 6 years and a little more. And he said, even if he had continued in this way for 70 years, not even 1/10 of the knowledge which he had received would have been covered. But he stopped at a point where he said, to go further would be beyond the capacity of the human mind to be able to fully grasp. We may say it is a great loss for humanity, but on the other hand, what he did in the writing was, even as he revealed this body of knowledge experience, he articulated it as a power of his experience that while reading, while studying, while opening our mind and our hearts to that revelation, he lifts us out of the narrow mind, prepares us to receive the same knowledge that he received, and brings us into a state of consciousness in which that whole experience now can stand before us, entirely accessible to us as it was to him. He has given us the means by which we can climb up the levels of consciousness into that supramental vision and experience which he himself embodied. And it is this which is the greatest gift that we have in these writings. In the passage that he has mapped out, there are several important stages that we have to pass through. And there are two parts in us, two focal points that are a simultaneous starting point of the journey. Sri Aurobindo has a very different view of the cosmos than what we receive from existing traditions and religions. And I want to highlight perhaps the most important distinction. In all of the teaching as we receive it today in various lineages and traditions and religions, there is a gap between world and the divine, between matter and spirit. And although there may be gradations and levels and even worlds in between, they are all seen as stages, each one above the other, that we have to cross in sequence in a long journey to be able to enter in relation with the divine in purity. Sri Aurobindo, while still accepting this as one way of looking at it, emphasizes a different side of the truth, which is that all of these levels of consciousness and the divine himself are right here, simultaneous, coterminous to each other. Where is the divine? Not far away out there beyond in some distant heaven, but right here. He also has a poise in the distant heavens of transcendence. He also has a poise in each of the multiple gradations of consciousness. And he has a poise of distance, but he has equally a poise of closeness and immanence, right here, right now. Where are the intermediate worlds? The vital worlds, the mental worlds, the supramental worlds, and the Satchit Ananda, the highest of the heavens. They are all right here, in this space, in this time, in this very moment, simultaneously permeating each other. And so when we say we have to rise to a higher grade of consciousness, if we view these grades of consciousness as present right now, right here in us, the journey becomes not so impossible. Perhaps with a little help, we might even be able to achieve it in this lifetime, or even sooner, in a few years. And this is where we have the help of what Sri Aurobindo has given us through his writings and through his constant presence, which we feel even now, and especially on occasions such as this. There is a requirement, though, that we have to fulfill in order to be able to embark on this journey and experience these realities in us with ease. And that is, there must be something in us which aspires for the divine, which calls out, which opens itself, and which receives the divine touch, the divine consciousness, the divine light and love. There must be something, otherwise this journey cannot be begun. Of course, everybody has that something. There is always the spark of the divine in each one of us. But what we mean is, there must be something which is awake to this need, awake to this call, and awake to receiving that contact of the divine touch. Well, we can safely assume that we have that in us, otherwise we would not be here on this occasion. But that being the case, the question now remains, how much of us aspires for that? In practice, we begin with a small part of our consciousness that aspires for the divine. In special moments, on special occasions, perhaps when we are sitting in silence, when the rest of our nature is quiescent. And at that time, this part deep within us comes forward. It seems as if the whole of our being is lit up with this aspiration. It fills our thoughts, it fills our hearts, perhaps even it fills our actions as we consecrate ourselves to this quest. And then, when that moment passes, when we get up and move into a different space, very quickly, surprisingly, all of this seems to recede. The experience is gone, remains as a distant memory or a vague idea, and we are suddenly sucked into the rush of life. And we wonder what happened, where has that gone? You will find numerous letters to Sri Aurobindo and the mother of sadhaks struggling with this dual side of our world experience and spiritual experience. And Sri Aurobindo says, it has not gone away. It has only receded into the inner layers. Because in fact, it was always there in the inner parts of our being, and it was when the outer parts became quiescent that we could feel the inner aspiration, and it was as if spreading easily, spontaneously in the whole of us. The moment these surface parts of our nature began to get active, their activity covers, their activity clouds and blocks what would otherwise have been a spontaneous, simple light of our deep aspiration. And so there is a long period of conscious, dedicated, persistent work of gradually bringing that, spreading that light and that aspiration in all the active parts of our nature. At least to begin with, in the higher parts of our nature, in our thoughts or in our refined emotions, in the idealistic part of our thoughts and the refined devotional emotions. And if we can bring a brief touch of this light in these two parts, from there gradually then that fire of aspiration, or the light of that fire at least, can spread and can be consciously made to spread in the whole of our nature. To the extent that we are able to continue this process, we will find that what we received in those states of intimacy in divine communion remains with us as we move into the life activity. Perhaps a strong provocation may still cloud and cover and make us feel as if it is lost. But then we can recover more easily. And at least in the normal routine of life, something of that thread of consciousness, some reflection of that light of aspiration can and will remain with us. But this effort must be made. When that happens, then the nature of the work that goes on in us can be, not only becomes easier, but can also speed up, because it can be constantly a constant part of us, even if in a small part of our being. For example, if some part of the higher idealistic mind can receive this touch of the aspiration, it can receive the touch of the divine light and the divine knowledge in those higher parts, even while we are immersed in activity. Similarly, if some part of the higher crest of emotions of our heart's bhakti and faith can feel that, then somewhere in the heart we will feel constantly the closeness of the divine presence and the constant help which is actually with us. The mother spoke of this, and it is a fact of our life's experience, that she said each time when she sees somebody, a connection is formed from her to us, and a part of her comes as an emanation and stays with us always, helping us in our spiritual journey, protecting us in the life journey. But she said, for that help, although the help and protection are always there, for that help and protection to be effective, we must call. Because in the act of calling, something in us opens to her help and protection. Otherwise, we are so immersed and so closed in our routine of life that although the help is there from outside, it cannot penetrate our own shell of self-obsession. So briefly, a part of us has to break out of our self-obsession and turn to her in a call. And that creates the gap in the shell, the passage through which her light, her guidance and help can immediately be effective. But the fact that she is present with us is undeniable. And it does not matter whether we have seen her. What matters is she has seen us. The mother explained that this emanation, although a part of her consciousness, is herself. It is not like a piece, not a piece of a finger that is put out. It is herself putting up a certain aspect, emphasizing an aspect relevant for our individual need. But it is herself in totality which is behind that. And so, we have an enormous advantage of the mother herself present, leading us in our journey. And if we were to use a different set of words, the mother is nothing but the power of Sri Aurobindo that flows out of him to act on us, to act in the world. It is Sri Aurobindo's consciousness, Sri Aurobindo's dynamic power, which is present with us in the form of the mother, leading our life's journey. The reason why all these gradations of consciousness are not directly accessible to our experience is because there is nothing in our surface personality and the way it is organized that is able to directly respond to these realities. The parts which respond are deep within, in the recesses of the heart or in the peaks of the mind. And we don't normally live in these parts. If we could train ourselves to live in these parts, then of course the perception and the contact would be vivid constantly. Or, as we discussed, something of those parts must begin to reflect in our surface parts, and then we can feel the contact. But really now the question boils down to this: how much of us responds to these ranges of consciousness which are all simultaneously present right here? I use the analogy of the radio because it is something which is more accessible to the modern mind. At this very moment, right now, there are thousands of different frequencies, millions of different frequencies of radio waves passing right through us, through our body, through our brain. They all carry some knowledge. There are radio channels of music, of talks, of all kinds of information. At this very moment, through us, all the mobile phones and their conversations taking place in a range of a kilometer at least are all passing right through us, and yet we feel nothing. Because there is nothing in our body organization which responds to those frequencies. This is really the crux of the problem. If there was some part in us which did respond and vibrate to those frequencies, we would catch it. There is an unusual case which demonstrates this. A medical oddity. A man who, after a tooth filling, found that he was listening to a radio station all the time. And he was wondering, what is this? Is he hearing sounds? Has he gone mad? It took a little bit of medical investigation to discover that the particular filing of tooth that had been put had a metal component whose size was just the multiple of the frequency of the radio wave of that station, and it was vibrating to that station. And so through the tooth, in the vibration of the tooth, he would hear the radio constantly, 24 hours. It's a very interesting example because it shows us the principle as it applies even to the spiritual consciousness. If there is some part in us which vibrates at that frequency, it immediately begins to respond both to call and to receive. So when we say the supramental consciousness is right here, as is the mental and the vital world, and even the subtle physical worlds are right here simultaneously, we are not able to see them or hear them or feel them because our biological senses are not organized to respond to that level of vibrational quality. Ramana Maharshi was, when he used to walk on the Arunachala mountain, he spoke on occasions of some of the subtle things that he saw. He said that deep in there, inside that mountain, there was a whole township with people living there, houses, streets, lights. And he said, I can see it just like that. There are many who have wondered whether there's a hollow cave and whether the township can be seen if you drill a hole in. But in most such cases, it is not in the gross physical vibration, but in the subtle physical. And in the subtle physical, as you move through the vibration from the gross physical to the subtle physical, you enter this level of contact and communication. And the gross physical fades and becomes immaterial as your vibrational rate moves to the subtle physical. And the subtle physical now becomes the concrete reality, and you see objects and touch them, which are subtle physical and not gross. As you move in vibration still higher, you enter the vibrational quality of the vital plane, you will see the reality of the vital world and experience it in its terms, and the gross physical world would have vanished for you, or you would have vanished for it, depending on what part of you is in this vibration. And similarly, you could move up the vibrational quality of the mental plane and beyond into the gradations, through the intuitive, into the supermind. If you could move a part of your consciousness into that quality or that vibrational quality of consciousness. Unfortunately, the way we are currently organized, the range of our tuning is very narrow. As you can see, again to take the analogy of the radio, depending on the radio, you can tune in from one edge to the other in this range of frequency. You cannot go further because the machinery is incapable of responding. You need a more sophisticated radio to be able to tune to a wider range. In a sense, and we can look at the human being in this way, we are a miniature representation of the whole universe in which a certain range of vibrations has been organized in a bundle in the form of an individual. To the extent that that range of consciousness is organized, we are able to relate to the universe on those levels of vibration. So most obviously, through the way the eyes have been developed and the retina is sensitized to physical vibration of light, it sees this range of colors. It cannot see into the ultraviolet. It cannot see into the infrared, which other creatures can. What prevents us from seeing? Just the limitation of the retina. If somehow you could sensitize the retina to increase the range, well, we would see into the ultraviolet and the infrared as so many other creatures can. Same with our hearing. We hear a range which is 20 vibrations per second to 20,000 vibrations per second. Even that diminishes with age. But if somehow the ear's machinery could be made more sensitive, we would be able to hear a much wider range as dogs and other creatures can. And the same for touch. Our physical sensation of touch is limited to only a certain range of density of matter. We do not feel the air, for example, as an active touch unless it moves as a breeze. And there are still finer gradations and degrees of substance into the subtle physical that we cannot feel. But sometimes it happens that we are in a state of interiorized consciousness. We are no more depending on the gross physical senses. We are sensing the subtle body and its subtle senses. And we come out of this deep concentration or meditation, not fully returned into the gross physical, and we're still sensitive to the subtle. And then we feel something. We feel the presence around us. We sense energies. We sense the thoughts of another person. We sense their feelings, even sometimes at a distance. And it seems so easy, so natural, that a whole other reality is open to you. If the subtle sight was active, we would see domains of the subtle physical worlds and vital or even mental domains, which is natural for those parts in our subtle body. But even the subtle body as it is currently organized cannot go too much beyond the domain of the intellect. And even the power of the intellect is not sufficiently organized in most human beings. It is only there as a rudimentary function. And so, from a certain perspective, we can say, we represent the whole possibility of the universe in all the planes of consciousness, but currently what is organized is a very narrow band. But evolution is nothing but the gradual extension of this narrow band, widening the range until eventually we can respond to all the levels of all the consciousness of all the universe within this organized individual. And at that point, as an organized individual, we would look at the universe and we would see all these planes simultaneously. And with our awareness, we could perhaps narrow the focus consciously for a purpose. Just as when you're listening to a complex orchestra, you may choose to pay more attention to the drums or the flute or the violin or the clarinet and just pay attention to that, and as if during that period all the other sounds are not registering in your consciousness, although they are present and you still enjoy them. And such a state can come where the whole of our being is now entirely tuned to everything that exists on all the planes of the universe, and the whole reality that is the universe and the divine is like this gigantic orchestra. Everything is vibrating in these beautiful rhythms of the divine music that is this creation. And yet we may choose to narrow our focus to appreciate a small part of it, specially. Such would be, we may say, the eventual destiny of our evolution. But for now, in the immediate focus of our evolution, there are two things which are most necessary, by which this completion of our journey would be made. First is what he has described here, the need to rise above mind and its limitations to this higher power of knowledge that Sri Aurobindo has called the supramental. He says, if we can once cross beyond the mind's frontier twilight into the vast plane of supramental knowledge, there, he says, we can have a positive, direct, and living experience of the supreme infinities. And so this is the single most important, immediate phase of our journey. When the mother brought down the supramental consciousness in 1956, when the supramental consciousness manifested permanently on earth, she said the downpour was so intense, she expected everybody around her to have fallen flat. But when she opened her eyes, she was disappointed to see people rolling up the mats and walking away as if nothing had happened. And she said it was because the groundwork had not been done. The preparation of sensitizing oneself for the supramental consciousness had not been done. Because there was nothing in those people which would respond to the supramental consciousness. The entire rush could pass right through you. A massive, torrential pour of this spiritual power, and you felt nothing because there was nothing in you that vibrated in tune with it. Just as the billions of frequencies of energy of radio waves passing through, we feel nothing. And then she says something interesting. She said, 4 people in the world felt it. And here's the interesting part. In Mother's consciousness, everybody on earth was held. Like cells on our body, everybody was present in her consciousness. And in her higher part, she was conscious of each one of them. And she knew 4 people who had experienced it. And she said one of them was in Africa. And as it turned out, the person who was in Africa later wrote about his experience. And he said he was watching, it was late in the evening here, but it was early evening there. And he was watching the sunset. And suddenly, he said, the sky was filled with a golden light. And he just knew, deep within him, he knew that a new world was born. And that was it. A month later, or more, he received the message that the mother released subsequently about the supramental manifestation, and it only confirmed. Mother knew not only who had sensed it, but where they were even physically on earth. And if that is the case then, it is also the case today. She knows exactly what is happening in us, where we are at each moment, what state of consciousness we are in. And when we call, her response is immediate because she receives the call instantly. And so she said the groundwork had not been done to sensitize for the supramental consciousness. And that is the challenge before us today. Even though we know, we understand, we have read that the supramental force is active, we may even with our mind recognize its actions in the world. To be able to feel it and receive it in its direct action, something has to be done. We are, of course, all subject to its indirect action. But to be able to receive its direct action, something has to be done. And the one part in us, as we are currently organized as human beings, the one part which can recognize it is that psychic presence deep within. Our own higher ranges of mind which open to the supramental are not yet sufficiently organized. And that is the other side of the work to be done. But the one part which can already begin to respond, which can recognize its touch, which can receive its light, is that psychic presence deep within us. And therefore, the mother's insistence on what she has called the psychicization of our being. Not only to become aware increasingly of this psychic presence within, but to extend its influence bit by bit in all the parts of our nature, beginning with the more refined parts of the mind and the heart, but eventually even in the dullest parts and in the body even. And to the extent that these parts receive the psychic influence, they begin to become more responsive to the supramental force and its working, which can now act with less indirectness on us. The second thing which Sri Aurobindo highlights is the opening of the mind and the higher part of the devotion to the supramental consciousness. And we have read in our earlier studies of how it is necessary for us to consider that to be the single most important thing. And it is only by that one-pointedness of our whole being that we can make the breakthrough necessary most easily. Otherwise, to the extent that we consider it as an important thing occasionally, to that extent, its ability to help us also is to that extent reduced and less frequent. On the other hand, the indirect force is increasing. The indirect pressure on the world is increasing, and we see ourselves often pushed to a point of crisis. There are no simple solutions, there are no simple arrangements by which we can bypass the problems, and we are as if forced to grow by the indirect pressure, and often with great pain. Sri Aurobindo describes how it is possible for us in these higher parts of the mind and the emotions to open upwards, open ourselves to the wideness and the light of that higher range of consciousness, by which gradually it can begin to form in us the necessary responsive substance. The key is this, that although we may open to it, there is a period of working, of organization in which these parts in us, the tuning of the radio, the machinery which can tune, so to say, in us has to be formed and organized. And since this has never been done before in humanity, the process takes a little time. One of the important missions of Sri Aurobindo and the mother was not only to bring down that supramental consciousness, but organize it in themselves, to create a prototype of the supramental consciousness as it is organized in the human being. That once that is created, it is like a crystal which can seed itself and spread rapidly in humanity which aspires and responds. That, since they have done, this organization of the supramental consciousness in our mind is now a much easier task. But still, it takes time. More so because our own mind is so habituated to working the way it has been used to for the last few million years that it does not let go easily. There is a point of transition where the mind must learn not to rush to conclusions, not to remain in agitation and activity, and it must be taught to remain silent, to turn up, to ask for the insight, and then to wait for the insight to come. And when the insight comes, not to rush to capture and give it form, but to wait for the insight to unfold and organize itself fully. And this transition is into a state so different from the activity which the mind is used to, that it takes a while to train ourselves to form a new habit of working. But to the extent that we make this effort, already in us, something of this higher capacity of responding to the supramental knowledge begins to be formed. This is the point of the passage which we had read earlier, where Sri Aurobindo says that in the rush of the mind to realize that supreme divine consciousness, it tries to rush through all that actually intervenes without even seeing these great and luminous kingdoms of the spirit. And the result is it goes into something which it can never know truly. But these luminous kingdoms of the spirit in between, the ranges above the intellect of what he has called the higher mind, the illumined mind, the intuitive mind, the overmind, and then the supermind, and all the gradations of each of these. All of these luminous kingdoms, we can ask, why is it that all the great saints and avatars of the past did not experience them or see them? Perhaps some of them did. But in most cases, as this rush took place, there was not at that time in the human evolution these levels organized in our individuality. And this is really the point of passage now in human evolution. It is these levels which are now being organized in us which represent the next immediate step of evolution. And until they are organized, as we turn to the divine, there will always be this sense of the gap. And you break through a gap, missing the power of knowledge, the power of cognition of these higher domains, because they have simply not been organized. So Sri Aurobindo, in another text in which he describes the 5 bodies, well known in the yogic tradition, the physical body, the vital body, the mental body, and then the causal body and the bliss body. He describes how these 3 lower bodies are organized in the human being, but the higher 2 are still not well organized. They are still a vague outline. And therefore, we do not have natural access to those levels of consciousness. And beyond that, there are 2 more levels. Remember, the Sat and the Chit. He says those have not even been started to be organized in us. So in a way, if you look at the whole of our evolution and the problem immediately before us, we have this human individual, human body, and the gradations of consciousness organized so far, and it stops somewhere at the peak in the domain of the intellect. The ranges above, there is something vaguely formed but not properly organized. And therefore our inability to experience and sense, receive or express the realities of those domains, or even to cognize with supermind as we should be able to in order to know the divine truly in the very simple harmony and unity and light in which the divine knows himself to be. To share in the experience, the true experience of knowing the divine intimately in all his facets. All of that is possible as these levels will get organized. So when we look at the whole journey in these terms, things don't seem to be that complicated or that confusing. There are two centers, the psychic center within us, and then this turning above the mind, which are our immediate focus. And then progressively, as these gradations or these parts in us begin to be more active, their influence to permeate in the rest of our being, down to the most material part of our body. But that process may be slow. The fact that we have some part already responding deep within or high above to the divine consciousness and light already makes the rest of the journey easier. Because through these two centers, the divine help can enter us and work in us more directly than we could with our own strength. So it is this which I wanted to highlight as part of the text which we have been studying, and especially in the context of the special day at which we are at today. At several stages in the yoga that Sri Aurobindo and the mother went through, they broke through barriers, set a precedent of something which had not been done before. That is the work of the avatar, to set those precedents not just for themselves but for humanity. And so there are stages, for example, where Sri Aurobindo went through certain decisive spiritual experiences, went beyond them, and went into a higher synthesis of some of what may appear as contradictory spiritual experiences, entered the overmental consciousness, the supramental consciousness, subsequently brought down the supramental consciousness into the mind, supramentalizing the mind, supramentalizing the vital, the subtle physical, and then the last part of working on the physical was on. Throughout all of these, there were at that point problems in the world human consciousness, which also they were working upon in themselves as well as in those immediately around them. Certain sticky problems of human nature, certain tendencies, certain inabilities, certain barriers, certain internal conflicts, each of which they had to overcome in themselves and in the people immediately around them. There was one example which we heard about when we were interviewing one of the old sadhaks, and this was the example of a poet in the ashram, a remarkable poet for the kind of content that would just flow through him, of whom Sri Aurobindo said that he was one of 4 people who had the potential of reaching the supramental consciousness, and yet this person was extremely unstable, prone to bouts of moods, even at one point about to leave the ashram. And the mother commented that there is a certain difficulty of human nature which they are working on in him. And if that breakthrough can be made in him, then it will be a huge help for all of humanity. Now, in this case, she did not specify the nature of that difficulty, but one can perhaps sense from his behavior what it was. But there were many such breakthroughs which they were working upon, which was the reason why they also sometimes brought certain very difficult human types into the ashram for this purpose. What you have described is the breaking of the mental formations which Mother referred to, but that is only one of these many such steps of the work that she had to do. There were other such occasions when she spoke of certain transitions very decisively and said, this is done, this will no more, something else will no more be, and so on, where one may feel in that very statement of force that is released to break the barriers and limitations. But still you must understand, when she says that certain formations are broken, they are broken in principle. It does not mean that everybody is simultaneously freed from those formations. It means that the hold that the formation had in the universal consciousness, its grip, its persistence, that is broken. And now it is possible for any individual who wants to break free of that limitation to make the effort and break free easily. It's the same way as the power of the intellect. Once it is brought and established in some member of the species, it is possible now for all the species to attain it, but with a little bit of effort. Earlier it was not possible at all. We may see this, for example, in the evolution of apes. We see how the ape mind comes very close, aspiring as if for the mental consciousness, is unable to get to it because there is nothing in the brain which can respond to the vibration of the mind. But if by this persistence and the opening, something of the mental consciousness can settle in it and organize itself in the ape consciousness of one member of the species, then all the apes of that species now open to that potential spontaneously. And maybe if they make no effort, they will reach it in 100 years. If they make effort, they may get it quickly. So in this case, when Mother speaks of the breaking of this formation, it means now all of us can be free of this narrowness and rigidity of the mental constructions if we make that effort. Otherwise, if we don't make the effort, it will happen in a few hundred years. But it will happen because the work is done in principle, in essence. And now it's a question of its working out and spreading to become a normal habit for the human species. There's another incident also where Mother narrates, we have read this here a few months ago, where Mother narrates how during the classes that she was taking, she found that the children and even some of the sadhaks were simply not interested in asking any questions. And here you had the Mother herself ready to answer any question. You could ask anything and she would give it to you. And most people didn't have questions. And she said one day she decided to see why it was so. And there's this whole description she has recorded in great detail, how she found herself going down into the inconscient. And it was very sharp because the inconscient had been mentalized and it had these very sharp edges. It was almost as if it could cut through you. And she went down at the bottom and there she hit a spring that threw her into a new world and a new consciousness. But this shows that she was struggling with this constantly, the barriers of human development in and through the people immediately around her. That's why this was described by her as a laboratory, where the problems of human nature and the human development would be taken up and resolved. It continues even to this day. I recently came across another passage in relation to the supermind. I think it was in 1965 that when the Dalai Lama came to meet the Mother, Kirit Joshi was present, and in the conversation that took place between the Mother and the Dalai Lama, she gave him a certain assurance. And then Kirit Joshi said, "But Mother, now that the supramental consciousness is active here, all this should happen very quickly and very easily." The Mother did not negate that. Rather, she stated the situation in positive terms. But in a way, it was saying it was not so easy still. But she said, as good people come to power increasingly, the action of the supramental force will become more and more direct. Now you see what that means. She said it in a very simple way, very subtly indicating many things. That even though the supramental consciousness wants to act in the larger human circumstance, the power centers are still held by people who oppose the supramental consciousness, who serve the old consciousness of darkness, pettiness, narrowness, egocentricity, etc. And as long as the power centers are controlled by such people, the supramental consciousness cannot act for a larger external change. And so it needs to create the circumstances in which the right people can first come to power, for which there's a whole long preparation of preparing the right people. Now you'll remember Sri Aurobindo's letter to Barin after he came out of jail. He wrote to Barin saying that just 2 years ago, there was such a hue and cry all over the country. Single-handedly, Sri Aurobindo had been able to awaken in the whole country this thirst for freedom from colonial rule. But during the time that he was in jail for 1 year, everything became silent again. And Sri Aurobindo said, therefore, I don't want to build on this kind of a mental or emotional awakening. It has to be on a deeper spiritual foundation which will have a larger lasting effect. And then he says in that letter, all I need is 100 people free of petty egoism, whose minds can open to this larger consciousness. That is all that he requires. Now when you think about it, the requirement is so simple. For 100 people, for the whole world to be changed. But unfortunately, that has not been so easy. In 1965, you have the mother referring to this in the agenda. She says, Sri Aurobindo and I have been looking for the right man who can lead India for the last 15 years. And then she says, we found one person, but they killed him in Kashmir. That was Shama Prasad Mukherjee, whom the mother had specially invited when she declared open Sri Aurobindo University here. He was a politician, but a man of a deep inner life and a mind open to the new consciousness, in whom she found an effective instrument, selflessly committed and capable of wielding power. This is the problem. We have people who have an opening to higher consciousness, but they cannot wield the spiritual power or the material power. Or wielding the material power, they lose the link with the spiritual, or the ego comes forward and exaggerates itself, and so on. So it needs a certain preparation of the individual consciousness to be able to enter a region of wielding power without allowing the personal ego to mix in, and yet to be able to open to a higher spiritual consciousness selflessly. So the supramental consciousness has first to create the circumstances where such people would grow in sufficient numbers, and then create circumstances where they would be made to or allowed to come to power, because the power centers of the world are a cabal. They will not allow people who are not like them to come into power. They will ensure good people, selfless people are prevented from entering, or if they enter, they are eliminated very conveniently. And we see so many examples of that. So there's a whole change to be made, and this is part of the supramental consciousness's work, to change the climate and thinking in people by which somebody who is capable can be allowed to come to power and kept protected while in power. And so you can see how long that whole change might take place. But when that happens, then you have now an instrument, and through that instrument, rapidly, large changes can be made. And we are seeing perhaps for the first time such a possibility taking place in India once again. And perhaps hopefully even all over the world, it may trigger a similar process. But when that happens, and a few people selflessly open to a higher consciousness are in position of power, she said, the supramental action will become tremendously more effective and rapid. Sri Aurobindo has another interesting letter where he speaks of what he wrote in the synthesis of yoga and what was still left to be written, what he intended to write, which he did not. And he says he had planned several chapters in which he wanted to describe what happens when the supramental consciousness begins to descend and transform layer by layer all the ranges of the mind, the vital, and later even the physical. What difficulties it has to face and how those difficulties are to be overcome. And the problems that the ways in which the human nature can distort or dilute, mix or cloud even the light of the supermind as it enters. He did not write those chapters, but still the principle is already described in other chapters when he discusses how the Gnostic consciousness has to work through and transform layer by layer all the parts. But we have this idea very simplistically that the supermind, because it is all powerful, can do what it wants almost magically. But there's this phrase which we find repeatedly in Mother's and Sri Aurobindo's writings, the working out in the world. So 1920, for example, when Sri Aurobindo and the Mother were working for India's freedom, there was this very important event that took place. They were working on the higher planes, and suddenly at some point the breakthrough was made. And the Mother said, "It is done. India is free." And Sri Aurobindo asked, "How did it happen? Was there much bloodshed?" Because this was the main difficulty that they had to work against. How to navigate that whole passage to freedom with the least destruction. And Mother said, no, they went as they came. And she explained later that the world situation changed, would change, or in that plane was changed, that they could not stay anymore and they had to leave. And then Mother says, the freedom was achieved in 1920, but it took 27 years to work out in the ranges below down to the most material in human affairs. So when we speak of the action of the supramental consciousness, we have to understand that it needs to work through all these things and finally through the human instruments. And it can work through them inevitably, eventually, even if they oppose. Their opposition it can use also. But their opposition it can use and the process takes longer. Their participation it can use and the process is shorter. That's the only difference. So what can be said is inevitably the supramental consciousness will overcome. Question is whether now or eventually in a few hundred years, whether through a rapid harmonious passage of change or through much pain and destruction in transition. That depends on us and our conscious participation and response to it. But there is always this working out. So even in our sadhana, there is the working out which has to take place gradually as it acts. Yes. 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 The question was about why the freedom of India was in a condition of partition and whether the union is possible. Sri Aurobindo himself put it in a philosophical way. He said, when they initiated the action and the freedom was won, it was done from the overmental consciousness, not yet the highest supramental. And in the overmental consciousness, there is still the possibility of opposition and split and division. So the division was not inevitable, but it was possible because the action originated in the overmental consciousness. And in fact, he worked to prevent that division in several ways, one of which was what is known as the Cripps mission. Out of the blue, suddenly, this member of parliament comes forward and says that, well, let's give India a chance to become free provisionally with this transitional period. And everybody in the British government opposed it. In spite of the opposition, he managed to get a go-ahead, came to India with this proposal that India should accept to be part of the British rule for a certain duration till the war is over, at which point there would be a complete handover, and so on. The proposal would have prevented partition. But at that point, Sri Aurobindo knew also the powers involved, and at that point, Mahatma Gandhi had some significant power and say. In order to preempt what he was going to do, and Gandhi was going to refuse the offer, Sri Aurobindo sent from here Doraiswamy Iyer, if I remember right, as a personal emissary. Doraiswamy Iyer, by the way, is a very unusual person also. A sadhak in the ashram. He was a lawyer before he came here, a very highly respected lawyer. But of him, Sri Aurobindo said he was King Janak in a former life, as the father of Sita. A great king and one of the greatest in history, we may say. As a spiritual king, a man of spiritual realization who also wielded material authority equally. So it was that person that Sri Aurobindo sent as his personal emissary to Mahatma Gandhi, giving in writing the reasons why the Cripps mission should be accepted. And in that he mentions that it would also avert partition. But he mentions several other reasons, all of which are brilliantly insightful from an administrative perspective. And yet Gandhi rejected it, and the result was the unavoidable. Then after that it was unavoidable, the partition. But my point is that the partition was not inevitable. It was the failure of the human instruments and their obsession with personal self-importance, forsaking what was good for the larger interest of the country, that led to that partition. And on the other side, Jinnah, whom the British used as a tool for partition, he himself regretted it. And within a few months after partition, he said it in so many words that it was the biggest mistake he made. And a year thence, he made an offer to Nehru to undo the partition, and Nehru refused that offer. So you can see there were many attempts at various stages. Perhaps one can say even if he had accepted, it was not possible. We do not know. But Sri Aurobindo's affirmation is very clear that the partition must and will go eventually. Otherwise, India's destiny is greatly put to risk, and the work that has to be done is significantly delayed. It was a great foresight with which he said that, and we can see how it has unfolded subsequently. Mother, of course, worked subsequently over years to undo the partition. And something was done in 1971-72 when the Bangladesh war took place. At that time, the mother was guiding Indira Gandhi almost on a day-to-day basis. Even she was in touch with some of the generals of the Indian Army, some of whom subsequently settled in Auroville because of that contact which they had. They experienced something extraordinary. She guided the military strategy. As a result, the war was the shortest with the least bloodshed. But after Bangladesh was freed, Mother asked Indira Gandhi immediately finish West Pakistan. And unfortunately, at that point, the US intervened. Indira Gandhi accepted a compromise, even gave up. They had about more than 100,000 soldiers as prisoners of war, gave back those prisoners of war without any conditionality from the other side. We are told that Bhutto promised that he would work for a reconciliation, but he needed 1 year. But he was toppled within 6 months, and of course, none of that happened. So Mother said that that was a big mistake. In the agenda, the whole conversation is recorded. She says it was a very big mistake. India will suffer greatly because this could not be completed. It was a chance given for reunion. And then she tells, after a few days, she says, I have seen how it will happen. It will no more be by war. And the problem at that point was that the world powers still played India and Pakistan as their pawns. And neither India nor Pakistan was strong enough to resist that influence. So she foresaw, and I would believe, although she says I have seen, I would say that she worked for it and compelled that result. She says, I have seen how it will happen. She says, the world situation will change. The US will support India instead of Pakistan. And subsequently, Pakistan will break up one by one into 5 parts, each of which part will want to rejoin with India. And that's how the transition would be. We see the first signs of this in the last few years of a certain shift in international politics. But in the last few months, also the first attempt to bring together all these countries which are part of the SAARC region, which would form the united body of the Indian spirit. And Sri Aurobindo suggested that it would be in a federal structure that these countries would come together. So we're seeing signs of that, some hope for that in the coming future. That itself is a big thing. Yes. But it's fascinating to see in the clashes in the Middle East now, if we see them from the perspective of Sri Aurobindo's vision and the way he describes nationalities and the conflict between national identities, all of these countries were cut up according to who ruled them in the colonial phase. And it's the colonial rulers who defined artificial boundaries which did not match the cultural and even, we will say, the spiritual identities of those nations. And suddenly we had these countries which had internal conflicts, and they were often pieces put together or divided across other countries and so on. There had to come a point of transition where these borders would be rearranged. Now, it could have been done in a harmonious way if people recognize the truth of it. Yes, these are our true national identities. These are our natural physical and cultural borders, and form them automatically. We could have done that if we had the wisdom and the goodwill. We don't. And so it is through clash, through conflict. But it's fascinating to see that even though in the last 10 years, so many superpowers tried to use the Middle East as their playground for their own interests, in spite of their best efforts, things are moving in directions which they cannot control. And there is a huge struggle between very contrary energies, which have to be faced at some point, and a decision made among the people of what they want for their own future. I mean, not whether they belong to this country or that, but what they represent in terms of their culture, in their highest values. Will they go back to a barbaric value system, or will they turn to their own higher aspirations and values? And that decision has to come at the grassroots. Either way, eventually there will be a complete rearrangement of national borders and identities and even cultural values. But unfortunately, it is through pain because we refuse to make the change consciously. I was reading something interesting just earlier of how so much exists on earth today, enough exists that all of humanity could be free of hunger, of basic diseases, and of any lack or need. We have enough to take care of everybody, and yet we waste all our resources to such an extent. Just take an example. Everything that is manufactured today is designed to break down within 2 or 3 years. If you just think about what a humongous waste of energy, resources, finances, time, energy, everything is wasted. If we design them to last 10 or 20 years, and the additional manufacture we spread all over the world, everybody would have enough. We are creating an artificial scarcity, keeping the production lines going simply to produce something which will be thrown into the waste bin and will never be used again, when it could have all gone to take care of all the needs of the world. And the same with food and other things, shelter, everything. If you think about it rationally, all it needs is goodwill. All it needs is that you do not think in short term, but in the long term for a larger group, and everything will be taken care of. But, and that's the unfortunate part, that's the only thing which prevents the new world from manifesting sooner and more rapidly. The human refusal, that's what it is finally. When we look at these spaces, and we can end with this, these spaces that the mother created in the ashram and Aurobindo, all the ingredients of what humanity needs to live in the best circumstances, all the ingredients are already here. The separation from money as value system. Yes, we use money as a means of exchange, but not as a means of valuing. The community framework where we share and care with each other. The framework of minimizing waste, reusing, recycling, reusing even more than recycling. The equality of use of resources. Everybody has access to all the same resources without any sense of superiority or inferiority or denial or lack. We all have less or we all have more, but we all have it. And the underlying unity which comes from an alignment of aspiration, which holds it all together and which allows us to overcome all our differences. All of these basic ingredients are already here. And still we struggle. In both these communities, still we struggle because of the lack of the goodwill, a lack of sufficient integration around the vision. But increasingly, as that happens, we will be able to organize in these spaces what needs to be organized everywhere in the world eventually. And that itself is the breakthrough, that we have a space like this where the effort is being made and is moving progressively forward, however slow or fast. And through these two prototypes, the mother has already impacted the world and is continuing to impact the world. For the gift they have given us, and we can wonder what the world would be like without these revelations of Sri Aurobindo and the work that the mother and Sri Aurobindo did for humanity. For the gift they have given us, the one line that the mother wrote on the Samadhi, we implore that we may never forget, even for a moment, all we owe to thee. We can briefly meditate on this before we disperse on Sri Aurobindo's birthday. Om